Genesis 2:7 tells us, "And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground, and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul." I am a soul, but who or what am I? What makes me me? That's the question we're going to be talking about today. Before we start, follow us to hear about our upcoming live streams and everything else we're working on. You can like us on Facebook or you can subscribe on YouTube. And if you'd like to be notified of upcoming streams and videos, make sure to click the notification bell. I'm Ryan Hebert from Meet Jesus. Thank you for joining us. If you're joining us live, please ask questions in the chat box. And if you're watching later, leave questions for us in the comment section below. Joining us today is Dr. Josh Rasmussen. He's a professor of philosophy at Azusa Pacific University. He has his Worldview Design YouTube channel, and his website is joshualrasmussen.com. Thank you for joining us, Josh.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be with you.
Before we get started, let's have a quick word of prayer. Father in heaven, we thank you for the opportunity today to come and think about the mind that you've given us and help us to reason about it, to understand it, to think about it, and to understand the truth more clearly. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, the prayer sort of sets the stage for humility, I think, which is really what we need to think about these sort of deep questions. So thank you for that.
Absolutely. I find that if I don't ask God's wisdom, I don't know where I'm supposed to get it from.
Mm-hmm.
So what is your background? What is your interest in the mind?
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about the mind, especially lately, but I've always kind of been interested in the sort of foundation of things, including the foundation of minds. But my sort of major focus of inquiry has tended to be more on existence, and more recently it's on minds. But I can tell you, when I was in college, I was sort of open in terms of what to think about, the nature of persons, the nature of thoughts, feelings, like what are they? I remember actually having a conversation with a friend at work, and she was saying that we had a kind of like immaterial soul. And I said to her in response, I said, well, like, how do you know that? I mean, maybe our thoughts and feelings are just really complex physical states, and maybe we don't know how to explain or create thoughts and feelings from like silicon or whatever. But that's just a lack of our current technology. We'll get there, and it wasn't that I believed that. It was that I didn't know, I wasn't really sure sort of how to think about consciousness. And then when I got into philosophy and I began to take courses in the philosophy of mind, and I took courses by philosophers who don't believe in God, Jaagwon Kim, for example, Michael Tooley, who's argued for atheism and debates against God, various courses on the topic of minds, and those courses actually changed my view about the nature of minds. And one of the things that was fascinating to me was to see the problems with a sort of strictly materialist conception of minds. There are problems that aren't really just answered through building more complex technologies or through making scientific observations. And seeing that these problems are arising from serious philosophers. They are not starting with a Christian worldview by any means. In fact, David Chalmers, who coined the term the hard problem of consciousness, he's not a theist, and yet he has called this problem of accounting for consciousness in a fundamentally material world a hard problem. And so just seeing that really captivated my attention and has caused me to really investigate, okay, what is the nature of a mind? So that's kind of where I'm at. The next project I'm going to be working on will be a book on the nature of minds.
Okay. Well, thank you for that. So we've had this terminology, you are a soul. And I think that's a good distinction to make, because what we're trying to find out is kind of what is the fundamental essence of what makes us a person, right? How do we get into that? How do we figure out what we're even talking about?
Yeah, I love that question. Actually, I wrote that down sort of as a way of orienting the inquiry. is sort of, I had this sort of title, like how to even think about minds. And I came up with a few tips. And one of them that I wrote down here was to clarify the concepts by distinguishing questions. So one question you can ask is what I call an identity question. Like, what thing are you? Okay, that's one thing you can ask. But another question you can ask is a dependence question. So like, do you depend on matter? And then those two questions also divide into different questions. So in the identity question, you can ask, for example, so let me use a concrete example. Let's take a thought. Let's say I'm thinking about spiders. Okay, then I can ask, is that thought identical to a pattern of neurons firing in my brain? But now that's different than asking, am I, the one who has the thought, am I identical to a material brain? So for example, some philosophers will say that I am a material thing, but I have thoughts that are not reducible to patterns of particles in a material brain. This is sometimes called property dualism. And so before we even like look into arguments or looking into sort of how you might make a case for the existence of a soul, I think it's very helpful to just get clear, like, what are the questions, what are the concepts, what are the terms? So I was thinking we could even kind of spend a little bit of time there making some distinctions, depending on the questions you have in mind.
Absolutely. I think that's exactly the right way to go. And I mean, the one place that I can think about, okay, as far as a definition, is this materialism versus um, dualism. But
Yeah.
are there other distinctions that we need to draw?
Yeah, well, there are. I mean, I do think that the materialist, immaterialist distinction does sort of carve sort of a category of different views. However, even in thinking of something as material versus immaterial, that way of categorizing things, I think it kind of already presupposes the primacy of the concept of material. So, for example, when I talk with philosophers who are materialists, they will ask me if I think that I am non-material or immaterial, and then they'll ask me what evidence I have for positing something extra beyond the material world that we all know exists. So it's like there's material objects, like this is material, you can like touch it, it's obviously material. We know that material stuff exists. Why posit something immaterial? And that frames the conversation very differently than if we start in another direction, which is the direction that I think can be helpful to start with, which is to just pay attention to your own inner experiences. So think about your own thoughts, think about you having a thought, think about your own feelings, and get some examples. I mean, take some work. One of my graduate courses, the professor said, we're going to do some phenomenological research. And he meant we're actually going to research the nature of our minds. And he had us literally like close our eyes and we experience ourselves like raising our hands. And he was like having us pay attention because he wanted us to collect data that was relevant to the course, which is a philosophy of mind course. And I think sometimes people rush past the data and they sort of think we know what we're talking about, but we're actually talking about different things. You know, some people are talking about external molecules in a brain, and some people are talking about this sort of phenomenal experience. And we got to get clear. We can't even just use the word phenomenal experience because you fill the meaning of the word with your actual experience. So it does help to do this work. And when you do the work, it can help to clarify the concepts. So let me just unpack this a little bit here. When I think of a mind, I think of whatever it is that I'm immediately aware of in my first person experience. Okay, so when I'm aware of thoughts and feelings and me, the one having those thoughts and feelings, I take myself, I'm just using the word mind. I'm stipulating that word refers to that which I'm immediately aware of. Now, if you frame it that way, then you could think of dualism as the view that your mind is what it seems to be from the first person perspective instead of something else. Okay, but now you see that this is a different way of framing it because now you're sort of starting with your mind as something sort of obvious. It is what you know in your immediate experience. And then from this perspective, you can ask, okay, well, why think that your mind is, instead of being what it sort of seems to be from the first person perspective, that it's reducible to something external to what you directly immediately know when you know about your thoughts and feelings. Now you do see how that's a different way of framing the question?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I am trying to figure out what it means to say that it is what I perceive, I guess. Um,
So
because
we
I
got
don't
it.
really
Yeah,
perceive, a definition of what it is, as far as I can imagine anyway.
it's
Like,
preconceptual, pre-definitional. It's direct. So, for example, take a thought, and this is where I think it's good to do the work. Like, do the work of like putting a thought about zebras, like stick it in your mind, and think about that thought, and then think about another thought, like a thought about marbles, and then pay attention to what do those things have in common. Let's call that a thought. They're both thoughts. Okay. Now you don't yet have a definition. I mean, if you wanted to define a thought, maybe it's like something that can be about something, but then that's unclear because maybe maps can be about things and maps aren't necessarily thoughts. It's like pre-definitional. It's like basic. It's direct. I don't know if that helps at all or if it actually makes it worse, but that's kind of like the point is you have to like do this work to pay attention to what's most immediate, and the most immediate things are pre-definitional, preconceptual.
yeah, or maybe I'm not thinking about it right. Maybe I can understand what the mind is, but then my question is, how does the mind work, or what makes the mind, or something like that?
Yeah.
And that seems undefined from my perception.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, and so that this goes back to distinguishing. Yeah, I like how you put that. The identity question, like what is the mind, which might be sort of a basic thing that you can be aware of directly, versus what makes the mind. What does the mind depend on,
Okay.
right? And so it's really helpful to separate those questions because I've noticed in popular conversation they get pushed together, and it's helpful to separate them because your answer to the dependence question, what makes the mind, will depend in large part on your answer to the identity question, what is the mind? For example, if you think that what the mind is a pattern of particles, then you could say, well, maybe what makes the mind is another pattern of particles, maybe a less complex pattern that produces the more complex pattern. Then there's no hard problem of consciousness there because we've reduced the mind to the same category as the stuff that makes the mind. Does that make sense?
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, it seems like whatever the mind is central to what the Bible talks about when it says, when it's referring to life.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't know if it's the only thing, because we talk about life in animals and plants,
Yeah.
and I don't know where those distinctions lie, but it seems that if God is the only one that can create life, then that's the creating of a mind is something only he can do as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. One could argue for that. Yeah.
Um, so we've kind of touched on materialism versus immaterialism or dualism. Is that a good distinction, or is there another distinction that's better?
Yeah. So good question. The reason why I kind of like to divide it between the materialist and the immaterialist, or the sort of fundamental mentalist or mind first,
Okay.
so we don't make the material primary, is because I want to kind of leave room for idealism. So idealism would have the mind being primary, but would say that basically everything is fundamentally mind, and there's not an additional category of the material, except insofar as the material is analyzable in terms of the mental. Whereas a dualist, I mean, and this is difficult to be honest. In graduate school, I took a course with Alvin Plantinga, and we spent a whole month trying to define these terms. And there's a Stanford Encyclopedia entry on like what is physicalism. And at the end of that month, we came to the consensus that we don't have a good definition. So that was itself difficult. And so that's one of the reasons why, by the way, like I like to just start with the basic concepts rather than even starting with the definitions. Almost like start with a thought, and then we can start asking, okay, what is that thought? What does it
Okay.
depend on? Versus starting with the definition of dualism or materialism or immaterialism, precisely because those are sort of well-worn terms that I almost feel like breed more confusion. It's almost like I want to come back to those terms later after we've sort of built up the definitions a little bit. But sort of roughly speaking, you can sort of think of materialism as this sort of the view that mindless matter is primary. And then I'm sort of thinking of immaterialism as a kind of opposite view where mind is primary.
Okay. I'm not sure exactly where to go with what you've suggested here, so I'm just
Yeah.
can you help me help me do that? Because most of my questions are kind of centered around this materialism versus
Well, go ahead.
immaterial
Yeah, ask
dualism.
some of those questions, and then that
So
might be helpful, and I can try to translate them.
yeah, that would be great. I
Yeah,
don't want to steer into what you just said isn't the best way to think about it, but
yeah,
uh, that's kind of the lens that I'm having to shift my.
yeah, and that might actually be most helpful even for the audience too. So
All
yeah, I'd
right.
be curious to hear your questions.
So here's one question. Is there room in materialism for some immaterial component, or would that be definitionally outside of that?
There is room. So there's property dualism, which is sometimes considered a materialist view, or at least it's consistent with a materialist view, on which you are a material thing, but you have properties or aspects of you that aren't material, or in my terms, are fundamentally and irreducibly mental. So, for example, you have thoughts and feelings, and those thoughts and feelings are what they seem to be from the first person perspective, and irreducibly so. But those thoughts and feelings belong to, let's say, a material brain. And so that would be one way of thinking about it. Some materialists will say that the material is, I think, kind of maybe, I hesitate to say like all materialists fall into this camp because there's always exceptions, but sort of the bulk of materialists would say that what really matters is that the material is primary in the order of explanation. So if you think about like the unfolding of the history of reality, it starts without minds. It starts with just like fields or material stuff in space, and they coalesce in certain ways. And then some materialists would say, let's say there's three versions of materialism here. One would say that um, this rearrangement of matter never produces minds. This is called a limitivist materialism because on this view, there are no minds. You don't have a mind. I don't have a mind. We have no thoughts. We sort of think that we think that we have thoughts, but that's just
So,
based on a kind of,
so is that like a mental nihilism?
yeah, yeah, you could say that. I like that's a good term. A mental nihilism. You sort of shave off minds, or you reduce minds to the patterns of matter. Or the third view would be that minds aren't reduced to the patterns of particle, but they sort of come from or emergent upon the the mindless matter. And so that third way would be a way in which you could have some sort of immaterialism sort of built into the material worldview.
So is the challenge just trying to construct what I think the challenge is trying to construct what identity is, and so we have this first person look into what identity is because we're experiencing it. Um, but the way we would classify identities elsewhere has big implications for how we would classify it here. Does that sound right?
Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah. Did you have an example in mind?
Well, I think the go-to example of an identity question
H2O
is
and water. Is that the one
H2.
you're good? Oh,
No,
sorry. You go. I'm not
the
gonna.
ship of Theseus was
Oh
what
yeah,
I was
that one.
thinking
Oh right.
of,
Oh yeah.
which I don't know. Maybe it's worthwhile just explaining what that is and what that means, and then I'll figure
Yeah.
out what I need to ask you out of it.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So this is what made graduate school so much fun because we'd get around a table about the ship and like how you could have identity across time. So this is the story of a ship where it has some planks, right? And over time, each plank gets replaced with a new plank until eventually all the planks of the ship are completely swapped out with new planks. Okay. Now you might think that, well, the ship doesn't cease to exist and doesn't cease to be that ship just by removing one plank. And that's true then if you repeat the process, you repeat the process. So it continues to be the same ship. But then let's say you take all the old planks that you had swapped out and then you construct them into the exact same ship as that ship of Theseus. And then it's like, okay, you got the same original pieces arranged in the same way. Which one is really that original ship? The one with the same pieces arranged the same way, or the one with completely different pieces arranged the same way? And this just leads to almost like bizarre questions of like identity and how you account for identity through change. And so, yeah, this is obviously related to how you identify yourself as your changing material parts. Like, which thing are you?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. And so is the idea somehow that we need to have something consistent in order for us to be us across time?
So consistent, at least with respect to being the same thing. So this is why these concepts are so fundamental, because the same thing can change in properties. So one of the things that the metaphysician does, the one who studies sort of the nature of things, is just starts by making these distinctions. So there's a different, and by the way, I mean, it sort of might feel abstract and difficult and maybe even sort of nitpicking to like make all these fine distinctions. But what I find is that by doing the work of distinguishing the thing from the properties, making all these distinctions, it actually just makes you way more powerful to analyze these questions. And once you
Yeah.
get these powers, you get more insight that this is how it works. And so here I want to just point out that you can have something change in its properties. Like I can grow from a smaller size to a larger size, and yet I haven't changed in my me, in
Yeah.
me-ness, the me. Yeah.
It seems like it might be a, a continuity of experience.
So then there's the question of, okay, what does account for the sameness of me? And there's sort of like roughly three views. Now we're getting deep. This is like almost like graduate level philosophy here, but there's three
I'm
views.
taking us too fast.
So this is great. This is awesome. So there's the psychological continuity view, which is that what makes you you is that you have some amount of sort of psychological continuity from one moment to the next. A challenge with that view, though, is that psychological continuity comes in degrees. And so you can have a certain degree of continuity that you might say counts as maintaining identity for practical purposes across stage A to B. And then you have enough across B to C, and then C to D. But then A to D might be actually so different because those little differences add up over time. So that even on the psychology continuity view, the beginning stage doesn't count as identical to this far later stage, which is a problem if you think that identity is sort of strict identity, which is transitive across the links, meaning that if A is B and B is C, then A is C. So that's a challenge that a lot of people away from the psychological continuity view as being a view about strict identity, like you are strictly you.
Well, and I guess I'm
Yeah.
just trying to explore my intuitions here, because one intuition that I would have is if somehow all of the molecules of me or whatever make me just disappeared and then reappeared 1,000 years in the future, that'd still be me. Like
Yeah.
that'd be my intuition.
So the philosophers, they talk about the transporter case. So I wonder what you think of this. Okay. So you get into the transporter and it takes all those molecules and it relocates them on a planet and arranges them just like you. Okay. So far, so good. No problem there. So that you've been doing this all the time, never a problem. Well, one day there's a malfunction. And what happens is it takes the molecules and instead of destroying the ones here and then, okay, I need to clarify. In the classic case, what they do is they use molecules that are exactly the same as yours, but they're not necessarily one of the same molecules.
Right.
And the reason they do that is because intuitively, like in the ship case, you can be you even when your molecules are replaced with duplicate molecules. It's not like if I bump into you, I annihilate you. Your first person self is still there. And
Right.
there's no molecule that's like essential to you. So you could replace all of them. So imagine that all of the molecules are replaced and beamed onto this other planet, but then your original molecules weren't destroyed. And so they're also arranged in the exact same way. But now it looks like there's got to be two of you. And yet from your own first person self perspective, you can verify there's only one of you. And there's this duplicate over there. You
Right.
see what I mean?
It's a duplicate.
The duplicate. Yeah.
And it's kind of the same thing. I still don't understand how I am a mind, I guess.
Yeah, so this leads to there's the body view, which falls into the same problem as the psychological continuity view because of the transporter case and because the continuity is in degrees from one time to the next. So the third view is a kind of primitive view that nothing makes you identical from one time to the other. You could say there's a soul view that what makes you identical from one time to the other is your soul. But then people ask, okay, well, what makes the soul the same soul from one time to the next? And at some place, you just have to bottom out in a kind of primitive identity. Like, what makes the number one the same as the number one? Nothing, right? It just is. I don't know if that makes sense, but those are the main options that philosophers think about.
So you can take this where you want to go, but
Yeah.
have you gotten to a place in your own thinking where you think that you have good reason to believe that um, you are an immaterial soul that doesn't need any material part, or how do you think of that?
Yeah. So there's two parts of that. So one is the identity question of what I am, and then the other is the dependence question of what do I depend on. So on the identity question, I feel like I have the sort of clearest grasp by my first person witness of myself. And I would say that I am fundamentally the thing that I'm aware of when I'm aware of me thinking.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm using that language deliberately. Instead of saying I'm immaterial, I'm focusing on the very thing. And in fact, I'm doing it right now. Like, I'm thinking about me having thoughts like, there, I just had that experience. That's the thing that I am. And so my belief is that that's real. So it's not eliminated, and it's not reducible to the material. And just very quickly, my reason for thinking it's not reducible to the material is just this law of identity that if A is B, then whatever's true of A is true of B. Well, one thing that's true of me is that I have this immediate awareness of myself. That's not true of any particles in my brain. I'm as sure of anything. If I'm sure of anything, I'm sure that I'm not immediately aware of particles bouncing around in my brain. At least that's not what I mean by particles.
Right.
And so therefore, there's something true of me that's not true of the particles, namely this sort of immediate awareness convinces me that I'm irreducible to material particles. Okay. So that answers the identity question of like what I am. I'm fundamentally this me, this I, the center of consciousness. And then as far as the dependence question, could I exist with like all of my particles smashed? Now it's interesting because I'll hear these sort of near-death experiences where people report experience of leaving their body, and they'll see their body down below. And it's very fascinating because sometimes they'll report information that happened like in other places, and then it's sort of accurately verified. But what else is interesting is that even while there's like saying that's not me down there, I'm up here, I also kind of like wonder, well, what are they pointing to? Like, I mean, are they still in space? It seems like they still have a location.
Yeah, that's
Is
true.
this like a spiritual body? Like, what is that, right? And so I start to lose my grip on almost like what the word matter means. And this actually might be one of the most important things I share in our whole conversation. And it's about clarifying these terms. So I actually think that the concept of mind is primary, and the concept of matter, and I don't just mean primary in order of explanation, but primary in the order of understanding, that the very understanding of the meaning of the word matter is derived from our experiences in our mind, and we sort of posit outside of those experiences something that explains them that we call material. Okay. And the latest science on what matter is includes a theory that matter is fundamentally informational. Now, some people say this informational theory is just metaphorical, but I actually think it makes perfect sense to just treat this just at face value, that matter is fundamentally informational, and so a product of a foundational mind. And on this account, when I'm thinking about, do I depend on matter? Well, in some sense, I want to say I do depend on information. You know, like my continued existence, I think, depends on God sustaining the context for my existence. And if matter is fundamentally informational, then maybe I will say that I can't exist without some matter. But now you see how defining the terms really matters here, because I'm saying something that you might not expect a dualist to say, but I'm saying this after really clarifying what I mean by the terms. In the end, I kind of leave it open in terms of like, could I exist without any atoms. Well, if atoms are fundamentally informational, and if there's some informational states that are necessary for my continued existence, then it seems like I would need something like that.
So I think what you're saying is that you're not really sure.
Yeah,
You've only been able to get so far with this.
that's right. Yeah, I'm not really that sure about that. And it's helpful to really separate like what's clearest to you from maybe what's less clear to you personally.
Yeah.
And so for me, when I'm just honest with myself, it seems like one of the things that's the most clear is that I'm real, and that my reality, my first person reality, is not reducible to a third person reality.
Okay.
And that I don't think that my first person reality is derivable from purely mindless third person realities. So those three things seem quite clear in that order.
Okay. And so I guess under that kind of thinking, an immaterial mind is almost like not really understanding what matter is in the first place.
Maybe, yeah. Or it's
Or
treating
maybe
matter as
presuming,
primary. It's sort of
yeah,
treating the concept of matter as primary. And I would rather just treat mind as primary, since that's how it seems to be in my own experience, and then define matter in terms of mind.
that's very interesting. Let's see. I've got a few more questions
Go
that
for it.
are on a bit of a different topic, but we've got a few in the chat, and I'd like to get to those.
Okay.
So I'll bring it up on the screen here.
Well, as you're bringing that up, maybe I could just say, sort of in brief, that what motivates what I might call a fundamental mind hypothesis, that mind comes first, not just in the order of understanding, but also of explanation, is that I think it successfully explains a lot of things in a better way than the foundation, than the mindless foundation view. And just to point to them without going into detail, and people can ask about these if they like, I wrote down 6 different things. I think the mind first hypothesis better explains the necessary laws of thought, such as logical principles. The contingent laws of physics, I think, reflect the contingent thoughts of a foundational mind. The informational layer of matter, according to the latest physics, the existence of rational thought is, I think, more predicted in my view if the foundation of reality is a rational mind than if it's mindless. It's not here to say that it would be impossible to get rational thought from non-rational causes, although I tend to think that would be impossible, but that even if it were possible, it wouldn't be predicted. And then conscious experience, and then the existence of persons who have unified, not just conscious experiences, but unified experiences that include thoughts and moral sense and a whole visual field. All of those things, I think, make better sense on the foundational mind view.
Man. And my head's spinning a little bit, but that's really good.
So it's just the beginning. I'm just pointing very quickly. Yeah. So there's a lot there.
Yeah, I'm listening to what you're saying, but I'm still back at what you said before. Okay. So Jonathan says, thoughts on psychophysical laws.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So psychophysical laws would be the kind of connection between mental states, which would be like psychological states, that kind of first person experience, and the sort of third person states. And so one of the things that we seem to observe is that there's a connection there. If you damage the brain, it seems like that's going to, in some way, affect your experiences, right? And there's a lot of recent science showing the kind of mindfulness that if you focus your mind in certain ways, that will seem to affect what goes on in the material structure of your brain. And so you can think about these relations between the mind and the physical. What are these relations? Well, they seem to be kind of law-like. And so what are these laws? And some people have kind of said that, well, these psychophysical laws, what they show is that we can explain the mind in terms of the brain. But of course, others go the other way and say, well, they show that you can explain the brain in terms of mind. What I would say is actually that there's kind of two-way causal explanation there, and that the laws themselves reflect thoughts. So if I had more time, I would elaborate this. I won't elaborate it now, but I'll just point to this idea that laws have a kind of thought-like nature to them. So if you have like the law that if there are particles in this configuration, then there'll be thoughts in this configuration. That statement right there of a law is about particles, about thoughts, and that aboutness is the mark of a thought. And so I think of laws as being either thoughts or reflecting thoughts, or like thoughts that are decreed or acted on. So
Okay.
so I think psychophysical laws are actually reflecting the thoughts of the foundational mind. So that would be my view on that.
Interesting. Okay. Let's see. Anthony wrote in, Ship of Theseus is my favorite way to talk about something like the soul. And I guess that, so
That's cool.
my
Yeah.
take on the Ship of Theseus is that it's exposing that there are multiple ways to identify something that can both be simultaneously true and correct and useful.
Useful, yes.
Because if you just say, well, the definitions are fuzzy, you might think that means they're not useful, but it seems that even if they're fuzzy, they can still be very useful.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. Can I speak to that, or were you going to add to that
Absolutely.
first? Yeah. Yeah, I love that. Useful. Sometimes when I'm teaching on this, I'll talk about identity for practical purposes, for usefulness. And so we can sort of treat, let's say, a computer as being the same computer for sort of, useful. It's like, it's mine. I have a claim of identity. If I bought that computer, it's mine, right? But then if you really think about it, like metaphysically, like, is it strictly speaking the same computer if it changes a single particle? How many particles can you swap out for it to be the same computer? And to be honest, this has led a lot of philosophers to be nihilists with respect to material objects. So they would say that, like, strictly speaking, there aren't computers, there's just particles arranged computer-wise. Or strictly speaking, if there are computers, they aren't actually metaphysically identical with, from moment to moment, even though they are for useful purposes. Okay. And the reason why I want to bring this in here is because I think this shows a relevant difference, or at least a potential relevant difference, between persons and artifacts, in that I could treat you for practical purposes as the same person from day to day. Okay. But then there's this further question about, like, what are you actually the same person from day to day? And I would actually argue that you can't answer that question purely from a third person scientific perspective, because I could explain all of your behavior in the way that I might explain the behavior of a machine or a robot, in terms of, like, maybe material contiguity. But in order to see whether you are metaphysically the same being from one moment to the other, I actually think that this requires sustained first person reflection. This is where paying attention, doing the work to pay attention, makes all the difference. You can't get there from an argument or from a scientific explanation. You have to do this first person work. And so if you do that work, my prediction is that you're actually going to notice that there's you, and that you're going to actually be able to notice you continuing across thoughts, and that your ability to continue across thoughts is going to verify. It's not that you get replaced from thought to thought. It's that you're actually going to notice this identity of yourself, of the not of the thoughts, but of the you from thought to thought. And if that's right, then it looks like there's something about you that's importantly different from mere artifacts. I mean, if you do maintain identity.
Yeah, I mean, that's fascinating. When I think of a ship, well, for legal purposes, you'll have maybe the bow of a ship, and that's what we define the ship as. Everything else can change. And it's usually a good proxy, right? But when we have these fuzzy definitions, it's because we can have multiple senses of it. So it's the same ship in one sense because it's all the same boards, but it's a different ship in that it's in a different place, and the name was actually applied to something else. So there's multiple senses, and they're both true.
Yeah.
And perhaps, I mean, throw this out at you. It takes my mind to define what makes that ship. And then if I want to have a shared understanding, I've got to have a shared understanding with another mind.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps, does it make any sense to say what makes me me is the mind that created and defines me?
I think that it presupposes a mind. So like if it takes a mind, I was actually talking with a philosopher the other day about this, and he was telling me, suggesting that persons are social constructions. And I was thinking, well, who constructs them, right? I mean, isn't
Right.
it persons who construct the social constructions? And then you have a kind of circularity problem. So that's one thought when I think about minds treating something for practical purposes. Well, are minds treating themselves as minds, or are they minds prior to themselves treating themselves as minds? And I would argue that minds exist prior to anything the mind actually does in terms of treating itself in a certain way.
Yeah, and it, if the mind disappears, does that make, if the creating mind disappears, which obviously wouldn't be the case for God, but you know, if another mind created a third mind, would that mean that the third mind stops existing, or that the dependence is
Aha.
perpetual? I don't know,
Yeah, that's
I don't
very
know how to think of
interesting.
that.
Yeah. No, that's very interesting. Yeah, like we could produce other minds with our minds.
All right.
Yeah.
Anthony Rodin just asked, four-dimensionalism. Can you, maybe you know what he's talking about?
Yeah. So, this is a theory in the philosophy of time, sometimes called the block theory, where time is a fourth dimension. So you've got the three dimensions of space, and then you've got this additional time dimension. And other philosophers of time will sort of a different view would be, let's say, presentism, where instead of thinking of time as a dimension of space, where the past and the future exist, just like over there in the past or over there in the future. Instead, all that exists is the present, and the past was, and the future will be, but it's not actually a dimension, right? Now, the different theories of time come into play when you're thinking about the nature of persons across time. So, for example, let's say four-dimensionalism is true, okay? And so that means that the past actually exists, and that means if I exist in the past, then I'm actually existing over there. Okay, but now there's a certain kind of puzzle, because it looks like there's some things that are true of me now that weren't true of me then. So like right now, I'm feeling curious. But there was a time when I was feeling not curious.
Yeah.
Well, now, but if I actually exist in the past and I'm the same being, numeric identity through time, I am that one. That means I'm both curious and not curious, simpliciter. That's a contradiction, right? So how do you resolve that? And I mean, this is, the sort of the advanced stuff here, but one of the ways you try to resolve that, if you're a four-dimensionalist, is you'll say there's different strategies, but one will be to sort of index your properties. So you say, I'm curious at this time and not curious at this other time. I actually have objections to that. I won't go into that. Another strategy is to say that actually you don't preserve your identity through time. You don't endure through time, but instead you what's sometimes called perdure, which means that you have temporal parts. You persist by having different temporal parts, different parts at different parts of time, and you're not like wholly present at any given time. I'll just tell you, I mean, just for whatever it's worth, without making an argument for it, my view is that I endure. So I don't have temporal parts. I'm wholly present right now. And that I actually have properties simpliciter that aren't time indexed. Actually, time index properly defined in simpliciter properties. And so I do feel the pain of the contradiction on four-dimensionalism. But then this is one of my reasons for not being a four-dimensionalist. So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah.
I mean, I don't think I've ever thought about it in the terms you just described it, but I
But
think,
there are people who are four-dimensionalists who are dualists, and I respect them, and I would defend their. I mean, I can see how their view is a respectable view as well.
sure, yeah.
Yeah.
I just mean, you described, what sounds like a presentist view to me.
Yeah.
And I've never heard it described like that. It's certainly not words I'd ever use, because I don't understand half of them. But that does seem most reasonable to me as well.
Well, that's great. That's awesome. I'm glad that you think my view is the most reasonable one. It makes me feel good about myself.
Right. Uh, let's see. That's a good question. What does the matter as information view imply about the mind of God?
Wonderful question. Yeah, and this is, by the way, recent thinking on my part. I got to thinking about this a lot because one of my friends was inspiring me to think more about what you might call the reverse hard problem of consciousness. So, if the hard problem of consciousness is the problem of getting mind from mindless matter, the reverse hard problem of consciousness would be how do you get matter, fundamentally mindless matter, from mind? How is that possible? And this got me thinking a lot more about like, well, what is matter? I feel like I have a grip on my thoughts, my feelings, my pattern of experiences, but what's this stuff out there, the external stuff that I posit to explain my pattern of experiences? I mean, even for example, my own brain. Like, I do believe that I have a brain. I think I've got good reason to think that I have a brain, but I don't have any direct knowledge. It's based on inference. It's based on testimony. It's based on seeing YouTube videos where it shows other people's brains. And I think, well, I'm probably like them. Probably if we open this up, you wouldn't find like a ghost or something. But it's possible, right? Like, there's just completely empty in here. Like, that's conceivable. Okay, so I'm wondering, like, well, what is matter fundamentally? And I was reading some of the physics on this, and they were describing matter as decomposable into particles, but then particles really ultimately being kind of like disturbances of fields, and then fields being based ultimately on information. And then I think of like information as just a product of a mind. And so the way that I would think of God's mind is it's just the most fundamental mind. It's the most fundamental reality. And that God's mind is able to produce thoughts which are informational. And I've even had the idea that maybe God, this might sound strange, but and maybe it's because it is strange, but God can produce thoughts into his own being or substance, and that this causes the this sort of informational state that is foundational to what we call matter. And so in that sense, like, it's in him, it's in God that we move and have our being, because the informational states are like literally in God's being. So that's kind of how I might think of that in that way.
That's really interesting. So, kind of aside, I guess, but my dad, whenever I start talking like this kind of stuff, which is always super interesting, my dad will say, "Hold, just be careful. There's things that are revealed, there's things that we know, and then there's things that we try to figure out, and we make it up, we get it wrong." How do you feel about how we interact with philosophy and and following what we see in the Bible, and making sure we have our priorities straight?
I felt like the prayer that you started out with kind of set the stage for kind of humility. There's that verse, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And I was actually thinking about that kind of recently. Like, why is the fear of the Lord the beginning of wisdom? But if you think of the Lord as like ultimate reality, fear is sometimes translated respect. It's like you're humbling yourself to ultimate reality. You realize that it sets the standard, not just like your own inner mind, because your own inner mind can be wrong, right? And so when you have that kind of like humble attitude of realizing that I could be wrong, and fundamental reality, actual reality, sets the standard on what's true. In fact, actually, that word true literally means real. So when Jesus says, like, I am the way, the truth, and the life, one translation of that is I'm the way, the real, and the life. And so I think there is something about that humility. Now, let me just tell you, I get that. I've gotten that a lot as well. Like, be careful, your philosophy might sort of lead you astray. And I think that really it's kind of a caution against pride, and I think that humility does protect you from that, and abiding with God, inviting God's spirit. I'll do this sometimes, not always. I don't always remember to do this, but just like, okay, God, like, help me to understand, and just that kind of humility.
And the way that I
yeah,
have seen you interact with people that hold wildly different views from you is that you're always careful to understand their position,
yeah,
or to keep digging to understand what they're saying. And
yeah,
I think that kind of is fundamental to making sure that we're doing that.
yeah. And
Um,
ultimately, I just have to say, there's no fear in exploring God's world, because especially if you're doing it with him, because you'll just find out more, and you might find out some things that are scary. So in that sense, maybe there is a little bit of fear, but what's scary about it is that maybe it's different than you thought. Like maybe God is sort of bigger than what you imagine. In fact, he surely is, right? And maybe even our sort of frame of religion doesn't like capture all of him. Like maybe it'll take all of eternity to keep discovering new sides of God, right? And when I think about that, I feel actually just kind of excited. I think the other thing, and I'll end with sort of this thought on this, is like, since I'm a philosopher, what makes me excited is exploration. Like that's what gets me going, right? And not everybody has the same role, and not everybody should have the same role. I mean, there are different people who have different purposes, so we all work together like as one body. But what I found is that sometimes the explorers, they will sometimes feel like their work is not understood or appreciated, especially if people are saying, oh, don't go over there, that's dangerous, that's dangerous. And then the explorers might start thinking, wait, are you afraid of finding what's true? Is that why you're telling me not to go over there? Are you worried? Are you trying to protect your view? And so I think this actually can lead to kind of a divide where you've got some explorers out in the wilderness and they feel like their work isn't really fully celebrated by the church. And I actually feel like this is a root of a divide between science and religion, is that you've got a lot of explorers out there, and maybe the voices they hear from the church is sometimes, their wisdom comes through tension. So, there is something wise about like, be careful, be humble, but on the other hand, I almost just want to say, okay, explorers out there, what you're doing is so important. Like, we need your sight.
Yeah.
And so that's even kind of what I want to say to people, even in church. It's like, yeah, I appreciate the warning. Thank you for that.
Yeah. I mean, I think if somebody just that I don't know very well in church is telling me stuff like that, it may very well be that they are afraid of what I might come up with. But when I have family members, my dad telling me this, I know that it's not about that. It's that they're worried about truth, and they've seen other people take totally different paths as far as truth because they've relied on their own thinking.
Well, my mom has said that to me, and she said that to me back when I was in college. And I remember at the time, I felt the sincerity of her heart, but also, and I think it was because maybe somewhat a level of immaturity, but also just kind of seeing another culture. I also remember even feeling from my own mom, the fact that she was saying that was kind of tugging on this worry that maybe religious people are trying to protect their religion. That, even from my own mom, and I mean, her heart is pure as any heart I know. And so I knew that she had, noble interest there. So it's a great question.
All right, we got one more question here. Thoughts on priority cosmopsychism as opposed to the foundational mind hypothesis?
Wow, you have. Oh, this is Tanner. I know Tanner. I was gonna say you've got some really stellar viewers watching this. These are top questions. Okay, so priority cosmopsychism. This actually comes up in my dialogue with Felipe Leon on our book. In our book, Is God the Best Explanation of Things? And he sort of floats this idea that fundamental reality actually has conscious elements as a way of taking consciousness seriously, because I discuss the hard problem of consciousness, and then he responds by kind of taking David Chalmers' route of saying, well, maybe there is a kind of fundamental intrinsic conscious-like or proto-conscious-like stuff or properties or features of fundamental reality. And then the sort of priority part there is that there's a kind of, I ended up asking him this question about the binding problem. Like, how do you bind all the elements of consciousness to produce selves? And then he had this idea that, well, maybe the whole of the foundation is sort of prior to its parts, and it provides a kind of unified conscious realm. And I'm still not quite sure, like, well, how do you get like my unified self? But maybe this can happen somehow. I mean, to be honest, when I think of the foundational mind hypothesis, I would think of it as being consistent with a variety of different theories, including that one, including Felipe's theory there. Now, he had a kind of Russellian monism where he was suggesting, I think, that in addition to mind being primary, there's also material properties that aren't mental, which are it's like co-fundamental. So you have like two different properties that are co-fundamental, if I'm not misunderstanding him. And I mean, my thought tends to be quite friendly toward that sort of thing, because I think it's in the right direction. I mean, that's right. I think fundamental reality has a kind of consciousness to it. I don't think that there's, well, let me put it this way. I think that a theory that sort of simplifies the root of reality is going to be intrinsically more probable than one that adds unnecessary complexity. And so in my view, the sort of ultimate root of reality is just divine perfection, from which I tease out some of the other divine attributes like knowledge, power, and goodness. So I don't really see a place for fundamental material properties that aren't explained by some prior properties, especially if matter is fundamentally informational, then information states are based in the mind. So that's how I would think of that.
Would that lead us to thinking something along the lines of the universe is the mind of God? Like they're the same thing?
So this is so tricky again because of terms. I mean,
Yeah,
and it's hard.
absolutely.
I feel even myself, even to talk about this, because I know how quickly one set of terms can be associated with one thing versus another. But like
Right.
when I ponder this, when I'm like walking across the block, just thinking in my philosophy zone, and I'm like thinking, like, what does it mean for God to span the universe? Is it just that he's like aware of each part? But what does even that mean, to be aware of each part? And I'm thinking about, like, could I say the universe is kind of like God's body? Was that a metaphor?
Yeah.
What does that really mean? Can God exist without this universe? Well, I mean, I don't think he needs this universe to exist. But the idea that God unfolds an expression of himself through informational states that are manifested to our minds as what we might call matter or geometry, that seems about right. I mean, that actually seems consistent with the Judeo-Christian view of God. It's filling in details there.
Yeah, I mean, even if the fundamental reality was matter is just what God thinks of,
Yeah.
um, which I guess might be kind of a different way to say it's informational. It's
Yeah.
information he has. Um, I still think there would still be an obvious distinction that would need to be made, that just because it's a thought that he has, and maybe we are a thought that he has, doesn't mean that we are God ourselves,
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
any more than our thoughts are us.
Yeah. Yeah. And just because God may manifest himself in the universe doesn't mean he is the universe.
Right.
But I mean, this is where words get tricky, because I have some friends, and the way they use the term universe, I start to wonder if there's actually a translation, so that they really are referring to God under a different sort of conceptual lens. They are saying, because here, let me explain this. And this goes back to the cosmophysicism there. Those who would say that God is the universe would still say God isn't, some of them anyway, would say God isn't trees, because they would say that the universe is different from the parts of the universe. And so there's still a kind of almost like a priority of the whole. And so if you think of like the whole as a distinct thing from its parts, and the whole is prior to or fundamental to its parts, and if what makes it a part is that it's in the whole, then I start thinking, well, how is that really different than saying we're all in the sense that God is everywhere? So God overlaps everything. So like we're all in God. God is prior to all of us. We aren't God. Do you see what I'm trying to say? And then once you start
Yeah.
like teasing these apart, it starts getting interesting. I'm not sure how to even distinguish the views sometimes,
Yeah,
fundamentally.
and I guess when I think about this too hard, at some point I have to say, man, this is getting way past what I know, and I just need to back up and think about things in the terms, the language that's in the Bible. That way, to help me understand how I should be talking about it, how I should be thinking about it, not to disregard the other
Yeah.
thoughts, but to guide them hopefully in a better direction.
Yeah. If the Bible speaks to it, I mean, and that's
Yeah,
where
absolutely.
I sort of think of the biblical data as providing a certain set of data, like maybe a frame. And that frame is consistent with a wide range of truths, and even truths that we can know. I mean, that there's no highest prime number, like that was a question. And then we were able to demonstrate that for every prime, there's a higher prime. It doesn't come from the Bible, right? And you say, oh, well, that's not a theological claim. Well, I mean, here's something that we've proven mathematically together with the Bible, which is that God knows that there's no highest prime. That's a theological claim, right? But that's not itself in the Bible. What you get in the Bible is that God knows everything, right? Or God has a maximal mind. And so anyway, I'm pointing to that just because I think it's actually helpful for your viewers to sort of think of maybe how a philosopher kind of thinks about the Bible and how I would explore things sort of in light of the Bible, and how I don't really see the Bible itself as even constraining my inquiry, but instead maybe providing a kind of frame or kind of another set of data that can maybe help anchor me.
Right. Anchor. I like that.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah. All right. So we've talked a little bit about presentism, and William Lane Craig, he holds the view that outside of time, without time, God still existed, but he created time and had to enter time because that's what time is.
Yeah.
I'm not sure what you think about that. You can address that if you feel so inclined. If time and space and matter are all connected, which I think is the idea of relativity, that you can't have one without the other two, would it imply something similar, that in order that matter and space, some representation in matter and space would similarly be required?
Yeah, so I'm not really quite seeing that. Maybe you could just tell me a little bit more kind of how you're thinking about
that. Well, maybe just the first part, that it seems that God would have to enter time in order to know temporal details, because knowing what time it is, what the truth is as far as what the present is a fact that you can only know if there is such a thing as time in the first place, if that's a part of actual reality. And so similarly, if
time is related to space and God is in time, I see what you're saying. Then God would be sort of spatially related.
Maybe, yeah, and that's not a constraint on spatially, just that perhaps he has to have some kind of presence in space and in matter in order to exist, the same way he has to have a presence in time. And I'm not saying where or how big or in what manner.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting connection there. And I've thought about that in terms of different theories of space as well as different theories of time. One of the first conversations I had with my wife, Rachel, before she was my wife, just like right when I met her, was about the nature of space. And so I was describing a kind of relational view of space, where if you subtract all the objects, then there's no relation, so there's no space, versus a kind of substantival view of space. And then you pointed to the sort of link between space and time, and there are different theories about that link. And so I guess, my current view would be that I am sympathetic to the idea that when there's change, there's time, and God is then related to that time by existing now. So I'd be happy to say that God is in time in that sense. I would tend to distinguish time from space more sharply. Perhaps this is because of the presentism in me. So I wouldn't sort of follow that inference so clearly that therefore God would be in space. But then for other reasons, I allow God to span space. So there's so much there. And I wanted just to add here about like anchoring. There's lots of data that anchors me. Like, so reason anchors me, empirical science anchors me, biblical data anchors me. And I don't want to even suggest, and I know this is a bit controversial, but I actually don't want to suggest that there's one set of data that I can just see that if there's ever a conflict between that data and some other data, then automatically without investigation, that one data has to be prior to the other data. And to be honest, because I can't see how to get that priority principle from any set of data itself, if that makes any sense.
Okay, yeah.
Anyway, I just wanted to throw that in there. It's
Wow.
sort of a meta
Yeah,
idea of how I think
I
about these
guess
things.
the priority data is the mental data, right?
Yeah, right. I guess that would be it, right? Yeah, nice.
All right. So I had stuff about materialism, and um, I hold a couple of unique views in general Christianity, I think, and they kind of go together in the way I think about things. And
Mhm.
that is, I believe in an unconscious state of the dead and a final destruction of body and soul.
Mhm.
Um, is there is there anything that this question of the mind has to tell us about those questions?
Yeah. Okay. So, in the unconscious state of the dead view,
Hmm.
is the idea? Let me just explore your view here, and then I'll relate some things to it. Is your thought then that you are a soul that exists unconsciously without a body, and then it gains conscious awareness with a new body? Is that kind of the idea?
Um, so not necessarily. In fact, that's kind of a weird way to talk about it.
Mhm.
Usually, it's talked about more like you don't even exist if you don't have a material presence or you're not alive.
Okay, unconscious
Uh,
isn't like gone; it's
um,
eliminated.
so I think that's often the way it's thought
Yeah.
about. But really, the thing that's critical about it is that it's unconscious. So if there was
Yeah.
something there that persisted, but we don't know what it is, but it doesn't have any consciousness, it's not fully alive.
Yeah.
Um, then that's fine. We're not taking a. I don't take a position on that, and
Yeah.
so that's where I can say, well, uh, and I'm still thinking in the materialism dualism
Yeah.
dichotomy, but that's where I can say, I guess I'm kind of okay with dualism in that sense. You know, maybe there's a there's something about me that's not just material
Yeah.
or more fundamental to me than material. Um, but I can't exist without the material part of me,
Yeah. Yeah.
or I can't be conscious without it. And so that's
Yeah.
why it's more around the conscious state rather than the existent state.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, it is relevant to think about, like, do you actually go out of existence, or do you exist as something
Absolutely.
immaterial, right? Because if you go out of existence, then the question is, could something that goes out of existence, could that numerically same thing come back into existence? And this gets into kind of interesting metaphysical questions about the essentiality of your origins. So some people would argue that whatever your origin is essential to your identity. That's called the essentiality of origin thesis. And I'm actually skeptical of that thesis. Not 100% sold on it, but there's a kind of argument for it. And then if that's true, then you might wonder how you can have multiple origins if each origin is essential to your identity, to your existence. Um, so that might push in the direction of you don't go out of existence, but you just go out of consciousness.
Okay. I mean, I'm very
You're open. I mean, you're not
I'm
committed.
yeah, I'm
Yeah,
not committed. I don't know how to answer this question at all. Even with my belief that there's no consciousness after death.
yeah,
Um, but I just from a religious standpoint, I figure I can trust God to figure out what makes me me,
yeah. How that
and
works.
yeah, He'll
Yeah,
figure it out on the other side, even if I never figure it out.
yeah.
Um,
No, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, the only other view I was thinking of that could be related to that is some people believe a kind of compound dualism, where you're a compound of a body and a soul together. And so then on this view, there is a kind of puzzle. So what happens when you lose your body? Do you become a soul, which was otherwise a part of you? Or do you instead continue to be different from that soul, um, because you were different from it when you were body soul composite? You weren't the same thing as that proper part. Do you continue to be different?
that's a
Yeah,
good distinction because something that resonates with me personally is the verse that I read at the beginning, where I'm here. This is Genesis 2:7. The Lord God formed man, and the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living soul. And the idea there is kind of, or the way that I think of this verse is, there's the dust that the body he created out of the dust, and then a breath of life that he breathed into his nostrils. Is that just like the movement? I'm not really sure, but combine the body and the breath, whatever that is, and that's what makes me a soul. And if I remove some component of that, I'm not fully me anymore.
Yeah.
um
I like that. I really, really like that picture. And this is helpful, I think, even for philosophers. This goes back to sort of the value of that kind of integrated view where you consider the biblical data, because a view that I've kind of been moving toward is, you might call it a kind of monism, where I'm one thing, one substance, not two substances. So like dualism makes you think of two substances,
yeah,
like matter and mind, two different substances. Well, I think I'm one substance, but I have material and mental faculties, and these are integrated into the one substance, which I would call soul. And so that biblical picture there, I think, fits well with that view.
that's that's an interesting conception. I kind of like that. um And what does it say anything about final destruction of the soul? This any of these thoughts that
And
we've
that would be
mentioned?
open. Sort of the metaphysics of the soul would sort of leave those questions open in my mind. I don't see clear inferences there.
Okay.
So then I think it would be a matter of, I guess, the biblical texts or other theological considerations.
Uh, Said a little bit differently, does the idea, if I didn't exist before my soul was created, or whatever makes my person
Mhm.
was created, does that imply that I can stop existing? Does the fact that something begins to exist mean it
Mm.
could end existence?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I've never really come to a definite view on that. So I know there is this view that once the soul exists, it cannot metaphysically be annihilated. Um, but then you might wonder, well, how could it be created? Right.
Right. I mean, that
So
matches, like, I my intuitions are not fully formed on it, but it matches my intuition that if I could not exist before a given time, then it makes sense I could not exist after a given time
yeah,
as
it does
well.
seem kind of weird. Like if something could come into being, it seems like it could, in principle, go out of being.
Right.
I mean, that kind of makes sense to me. I mean, unless there was some sort of not metaphysical reason, but maybe theological reason with respect to
Right.
God's
Yeah.
value. Like God values the being
And so
so
he won't,
much.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so he won't take it out of existence.
Right.
And that's a different question, of
Yeah.
course.
Yeah.
Um, but it kind of ties into this thought of time being something that God entered into and can't remove himself from. Or
Mhm.
maybe he can remove himself, but not without destroying everything there is. And what does that even mean?
Yeah.
Um,
That's a good example. If time began, could time be destroyed? That's a nice way of thinking about that. And then it might be, well, in principle, it could be like God could just annihilate everything and then just stop. There'd be no time
yeah,
if time depends on change. But you might think God wouldn't do that because it would be sort of morally repugnant to do
yeah,
that.
I might think that. Yeah, of
You
course.
might.
Where do I get that idea from? Okay. Oh man. All right. Do you have any other thoughts of that have come up in the conversation?
I think that's it. I think we covered the notes that I had here. So
All right.
it's a
I
big topic.
It is, and I don't know exactly where to go with it. It's a one I don't I don't understand even a little bit of yet. So, do you have anything that you'd like to let the audience know about for your work? Or
Well, yeah, I mean, like you said, you can find my work at joshualrasmussen.com. The next project I'm working on is a book on the nature of minds and their origin. And maybe a kind of final thought would be just sort of like why this topic is so interesting to me. And I think one of the reasons it's interesting to me is that it has to do with almost like everything that a person could care about, because everything that a person ever cares about is in terms of consciousness, right? And everything's sort of on the line. Like, will you continue to be conscious after you die? Well, it depends on the kind of being you are. And, so is the world fundamentally material? Well, again, that depends on the kind of being that you are. It depends on what consciousness is. And so when I think about this topic of consciousness, it seems like it's almost like the most significant, most cosmically epic question that anybody could think about. And also another reason I'm passionate about this is because I think that there are some things that you can be clear about, and not just through scripture. I think scripture can make things clear too, but God in his grace gives us maybe many ways to get to truth. And I think that through reason and reflection and paying attention to conscious states, you can actually become clear of things that are very significant about the reality of persons, their irreducibility to material, and even the impossibility of getting persons from purely mindless stuff. I think those are things that you can see through investigation, and so for that reason, I think that it's a very valuable topic to look into, because it can really motivate how you live. Do you actually see people as intrinsically valuable beings, as beings that have this irreducible consciousness that isn't just matter and motion? You're not just a puppet of the particles. And so I think that will affect how you live, how you live your life. Yeah.
You know what? I do have one other note. Maybe it'll be worth coming up. So for the immaterial side of things, I find that free will is probably the best argument that for me, that it's not just there's not just material components in it, because material appears to be deterministic or random, and neither of those can account for freedom.
Mm-hmm.
Does that strike as a reasonable thing for you?
So actually, yeah. So I have a paper on the puppet. I call it the puppet argument. It's a co-author with a philosopher from Yale and Singapore. His name is Andrew Bailey. And we have a few co-authors together. And one of them is on exactly what you're talking about, is like, how do you account for responsible beings who can choose in a fundamentally material world where the particles pull the strings, and whether those particles are deterministic or indeterministic and random. If they're pulling the strings and they're prior to your existence, then something prior to your existence is making you do everything you're doing.
Right.
And we articulate the argument in detail, and we work through objections that might occur to people through our precision. And through that precision, I think the problem becomes all the more puzzling. And it does convince me that having a fundamentally material world is going to make it difficult to see how we could have genuine responsibility.
All right. Well, thanks for letting me throw that in there. Thank you for joining us today, Josh. You can find more about Josh Rasmussen at joshualrasmussen.com. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Ryan Hebert, and more than anything, I want you to meet Jesus.